The initial perceptions held by German naval officers regarding American aircraft carriers were not born from dry academic manuals or sanitized intelligence briefings. Instead, they were forged in the vast, gray expanse of the Atlantic Ocean, where these leviathans first appeared as colossal, moving silhouettes against the horizon. In the war's early stages, when the Atlantic was the primary domain of the Kriegsmarine, the prevailing mindset among officers was deeply rooted in classical naval doctrine. This doctrine venerated the immense firepower of battleships, the reconnaissance and raiding capabilities of cruisers, and the stealthy psychological terror of the U-boat wolf packs. Within this framework, aircraft carriers were viewed as ancillary, almost experimental assets. They were considered useful for specific limited roles such as fleet reconnaissance or providing a modicum of air cover, but they were never regarded as the central pillar of a battle fleet. The Royal Navy operated carriers, of course, but these were seen by German strategists as relatively small, limited in number, and inherently vulnerable vessels that required the protection of more traditional warships to survive. This entrenched perception, however, began to fracture and then shatter as first-hand accounts of American naval prowess started to filter back to headquarters in Berlin. The first reports, often delivered by U-boat commanders returning from extended patrols, were met with skepticism and disbelief. These seasoned submariners spoke of encountering monstrous shapes on the seascape, ships of a scale that defied previous understanding. These were not merely enlarged versions of European carriers, they were described as something entirely new. Mobile, sovereign fortresses that merged the formidable displacement of a battleship with the operational capacity of a full-sized airfield. Naval intelligence supplemented these verbal accounts with intercepted wireless traffic and grainy aerial photographs. Yet these two-dimensional representations failed to convey the profound reality of these vessels. The true, unsettling impact only began to crystallize when German officers had rare, direct encounters, either through visual contact during distant engagements or, later, as prisoners of war being transported on these very ships. One of the earliest and most telling points of indirect contact came from the experiences of U-boat aces. They reported a disturbing shift in the Battle of the Atlantic. Convoys that had once been vulnerable, isolated targets were now operating under a perpetual, orbiting umbrella of air cover. This cover did not originate from distant, land-based airfields with limited range, but from these mobile air bases that moved in concert with the merchant ships. These American carriers were not timid auxiliaries. They deployed large squadrons of aircraft specifically designed for anti-submarine warfare. These planes could methodically scour thousands of square miles of ocean, forcing the once feared U-boats into constant defensive dives, radically inverting the roles of hunter and hunted. For officers educated in a doctrine where U-boats could attack convoys with relative impunity, the realization that the Atlantic's air gap had been effectively closed was a strategic earthquake. As the war's center of gravity shifted decisively to the Pacific, German officers, through intelligence exchanges with their Japanese allies, followed American carrier operations with a mixture of professional awe and mounting dread. After-action reports from battles like Midway emphasized not merely American tactical cleverness, but the sheer, staggering operational reach of their carrier groups. The American doctrine of projecting overwhelming air power across hundreds of miles of open ocean was a concept that challenged the very foundations of German naval geography, which was centered on the confined waters around the British Isles. The idea that a fleet could exert decisive influence across the vast emptiness of the Pacific seemed almost fantastical, yet the Americans were demonstrating it as a routine matter of doctrine. For a handful of German officers, the abstract became terrifyingly concrete when they were taken aboard American carriers as prisoners. Their subsequent debriefings and memoirs were filled with a sense of profound disbelief. They described entering hangar decks that stretched into the distance like immense, steel-vaulted cathedrals, each one packed with rows upon rows of aircraft in various states of readiness. They witnessed the industrial ballet of massive elevators seamlessly transporting planes between the hangar and the flight deck, while crews of sailors, moving with a well-rehearsed, machine-like precision, performed their duties. They noted the scale of the logistical support. Vast galleys and mess halls that fed thousands of men in continuous shifts, a stark contrast to the cramped and austere conditions aboard a U-boat or even a German battleship. The carrier, to these men, was not merely a warship. It was a veritable city afloat, a self-contained world of industry and life adrift on the waves. The sheer physical dimensions of these vessels were a shock in themselves. German capital ships like the Bismarck and Tirpitz were rightfully considered giants by European standards, but their immense tonnage was dedicated to heavy armor plating and enormous artillery pieces. An American fleet carrier, by comparison, could be of similar length and displacement, yet its entire design philosophy was devoted to a single purpose: the deployment, maintenance, and support of a large air wing. German analysts could not avoid the conclusion that a single such vessel represented the combat power of several immobile airfields, capable of moving at high speed and launching sustained wave-after-wave sorties. This single fact alone undermined the core tenets of German naval strategy, which had been built around the concept of the decisive gunnery duel and the guerre de course of the submarine. Compounding the tactical shock was the seemingly effortless strategic abundance with which the Americans deployed these behemoths. While the Kriegsmarine agonized over every sortie of its precious limited surface fleet and struggled to keep its U-boat campaign supplied, American carrier task forces seemed to operate simultaneously in the Atlantic, the Mediterranean, and the vast Pacific. Intelligence summaries from 1942 onward spoke of new, more advanced classes of carriers being launched at a pace that resembled industrial mass production rather than bespoke warship construction. For German officers who witnessed their own shipbuilding efforts in Hamburg and Kiel being crippled by critical material shortages and devastating Allied bombing raids, the American capacity to produce these floating citadels appeared almost supernatural, a testament to an industrial base operating on a different plane of existence. Beyond the raw statistics of tonnage and aircraft capacity, there was a deeper, psychological dimension to the carrier's impact. German officers came to understand that the mere presence of a carrier fundamentally altered the character of any naval engagement. A fleet centered around a carrier possessed eyes that could see hundreds of miles beyond the visible horizon. It possessed claws that could strike at enemy submarines and surface vessels long before they could even approach firing range. It provided a flexible, organic shield against enemy air attacks and could directly support amphibious assaults on hostile coastlines. For officers steeped in the traditions of surface warfare, where victory was measured in the caliber of guns and the thickness of armor, this represented nothing less than a total revolution in naval combat. It is little wonder that when German officers recounted their first encounters with America's aircraft carriers, their language was tinged with a tone of stunned incredulity. They had been thrust into a new dimension of maritime power, a synthesis of industrial might, technological innovation, and strategic vision that they struggled to comprehend. The floating cities they witnessed were more than just ships. They were a definitive declaration of how future wars upon the sea would be fought, and ultimately won. To the German naval mind, shaped in the 1930s and early 1940s, the very definition of a powerful warship was inextricably linked to its heavy artillery and its defensive armor. The grandeur of the Bismarck, or the Tirpitz, was embodied in their 8 15-inch guns, their intricate system of armored belts, and the immense national prestige they carried as symbols of the Reich's power. In this worldview, aircraft carriers seemed like a precarious gamble. They appeared fragile, overly dependent on their aircraft, which could be shot down by determined fighters or rendered useless by poor weather. However, as the Kriegsmarine's intelligence apparatus began to compile more detailed dossiers on American carriers, particularly the Essex class and their predecessors, they discovered a reality that systematically dismantled their assumptions. These vessels were not fragile. They were resilient, complex systems engineered for endurance and dominance. The metaphor of the floating city was not merely a poetic flourish, it was an operational reality. American carriers were, in effect, industrial parks laid out across steel hulls that stretched for nearly 3 football fields in length. When German staff officers first pored over detailed technical reports, they were astounded by the specifications. Flight decks long and robust enough to launch even heavy bombers, multi-level hangar decks storing 80 to 100 aircraft, cavernous tanks holding millions of gallons of aviation fuel, and fully equipped workshops capable of performing everything from minor repairs to complete engine overhauls. This degree of self-sufficiency granted American carrier task forces a strategic autonomy that Germany had never conceived of as possible. To men trained in European traditions, where fleets remained tethered to continental support bases, the idea of a ship that could serve as a self-sustaining forward base for weeks or months on end seemed like something from speculative fiction. The fundamental design philosophy was itself a source of shock. Unlike the heavily armored citadels of German battleships, American carriers deliberately sacrificed large-caliber gun turrets to prioritize vast, unobstructed flight decks and the extensive infrastructure needed for aviation operations. Initially, this struck many German naval architects as a profound design flaw, a willful disarmament of a capital ship. But subsequent battle reports from the Pacific provided a brutal rebuttal. The aircraft were the ship's primary armament, and they were far more versatile and had a much greater reach than any naval cannon. A single carrier could simultaneously launch reconnaissance planes to scout 1 million square miles of ocean, dive bombers and torpedo planes to sink enemy fleets hundreds of miles away, and a combat air patrol of fighters to defend the entire task force from aerial attack. The ship itself had become a mobile, sovereign territory of air power, fundamentally redefining the very essence of naval supremacy. Life inside these floating metropolises reinforced the city-at-sea concept even further. Intelligence described mess halls that could feed thousands of men per sitting, sleeping quarters, and sanitary facilities that were palatial compared to the cramped confines of a German warship, and sick bays equipped to the standard of a small, well-appointed hospital. German officers noted with a mixture of scorn and envy the inclusion of amenities like gymnasiums, barber shops, post offices, and even movie theaters, luxuries that were unthinkable aboard a German cruiser or U-boat. The underlying logic, however, was both simple and brilliant. A crew whose physical and mental well-being was actively supported through comfort and routine could maintain peak combat effectiveness over long, grueling deployments far from home. This focus on human factors as a critical component of military effectiveness was a lesson that German officers, upon witnessing its results, were forced to grudgingly acknowledge. The operational choreography observed on these carriers was equally impressive. The synchronized movement of aircraft via massive elevators, the flawlessly executed routines for launching and recovering aircraft, and the rapid rearming and refueling cycles were described as a form of industrial ballet, perfected to a state of near-total automation. While command and control on German warships were characterized by a rigid top-down hierarchy, where every significant action required an officer's command, the American system appeared more decentralized. On a carrier's flight deck, individual sailors, empowered by intensive training and clear procedures, acted with initiative and decisiveness, creating a rhythm of continuous coordinated motion that German accounts frequently described as both alien and deeply intimidating. Another profound revelation was the carrier's formidable logistical independence. With their own machine shops, extensive inventories of spare parts, and massive reserves of aviation fuel and ordnance, these ships and their task forces could operate for extended periods in the remotest corners of the globe without requiring immediate resupply from a home port. This capability was virtually inconceivable to the German Navy, whose operations were perpetually constrained by their dependence on European bases and vulnerable supply lines. The Americans, it seemed, had engineered a war-fighting system that carried its own logistical tail, granting them a strategic flexibility that appeared almost limitless. Perhaps the most staggering statistic of all was the sheer scale of the aviation capacity. While a British carrier might operate 24 aircraft, an American Essex-class carrier could deploy an air group of 90 to 100 planes. For German officers who still thought in terms of salvos and broadsides, this was a difficult reality to process. The comparison was humbling. A single American carrier task force could deliver the concentrated firepower of several land-based air wings, and it could do so anywhere on the world's oceans, striking targets that had previously considered themselves safe behind vast moats of distance. It was as if American naval power had developed the ability to manipulate geography itself, rendering oceans into highways and isolation into vulnerability. The concept of the floating city thus transcended mere physical size. It embodied a comprehensive philosophy of warfare. The United States had consciously chosen to invest in mobility, force projection, and long-term sustainability over the brute force application of naval artillery. They constructed vessels that carried not just weapons, but the entire integrated infrastructure needed to wage a sustained campaign. In doing so, they pioneered a new form of warfare where vast distances and geographic isolation offered no sanctuary. German officers, reviewing after-action reports and analyzing photographs, privately conceded that the global balance of naval power was shifting irrevocably. The age of the battleship was drawing to a close, and the age of the aircraft carrier had decisively begun. In the quiet reflection of their post-war memoirs, many German naval officers admitted that they had fatally underestimated the strategic importance of the aircraft carrier until it was far too late to respond. They recalled the first grainy images and technical descriptions of these floating cities, and the dawning realization that the Third Reich possessed no credible counter. Germany had staked its naval ambitions on the U-boat and a handful of magnificent but ultimately anachronistic capital ships, while across the Atlantic, America had quietly built an entire armada of mobile air bases. The shock was not merely one of steel and tonnage, it was the profound realization that Germany's entire naval imagination had been too narrow, too constrained by past glories. For men who had spent their professional lives venerating the power of the big gun and the thickness of armor plate, the American carrier was both a terrifying revelation and a stark warning. It stood as irrefutable proof that modern wars were no longer won by clinging to obsolete doctrines, but by possessing the vision and industrial capacity to fundamentally reimagine the battlefield. To the officers of the Kriegsmarine, these floating cities of war were simultaneously objects of terror and awe, the ultimate symbols of a new age of warfare for which they had been tragically unprepared. This profound sense of technological and doctrinal inferiority was further cemented by the Germans' analysis of American industrial logistics. For the Kriegsmarine, every major warship represented a monumental national effort, consuming years of labor, scarce resources, and intense political capital. A vessel like the Bismarck was a singular masterpiece, a symbol of national pride whose loss was a catastrophic blow. The American approach stood in stark, terrifying contrast. Their carriers were not treated as rare, priceless artifacts, but as standardized products flowing from a seemingly endless industrial conveyor belt. Intelligence reports from 1943 and 1944 spoke of shipyards on both coasts launching new Essex-class carriers with a rhythm that defied German comprehension. While German shipbuilders struggled to repair battle damage and replace U-boat losses under a relentless hail of bombs, American yards laid keels for new fleet carriers as if they were producing Liberty ships. The concept of an entire class of such complex warships being completed in a matter of months, rather than years, was a sobering lesson in industrial warfare. To officers who had personally contended with crippling shortages of steel, alloying metals, and skilled labor, these reports initially seemed like propaganda, but the grim truth was even more daunting. America's industrial might was on a scale that the Axis powers could not hope to match. This disparity was not merely quantitative, it was philosophical. Germany's war economy was a fragmented, often inefficient system, plagued by internal power struggles, mismanagement, and constant competition for Hitler's favor. America's war machine, by contrast, was a model of centralized coordination and breathtaking efficiency, fueled by a continent's worth of raw materials and a seemingly inexhaustible workforce. Carriers were constructed in parallel across multiple shipyards, a strategy that ensured the loss of one vessel was a temporary setback, not a strategic catastrophe. German officers realized with a sinking feeling that even a major tactical victory, the sinking of an American carrier, was ultimately meaningless. It would be replaced, and likely by a newer, more advanced model, within a shockingly short time frame. This industrial resilience bred a sense of strategic futility. They were not just fighting a navy, but the entire economic and productive capacity of a nation that had mobilized for total war without sacrificing its standard of living. The psychological impact of this arsenal of democracy was profound. The well-fed sailors, the well-stocked machine shops, and the endless stream of new ships were all physical manifestations of a system that was not on a wartime footing, but was rather operating at its full, unstoppable potential. German officers, acutely aware of the rationing and shortages on the home front, saw in these carriers proof that they were facing an enemy whose resources and organizational capacity were, for all practical purposes, limitless. The carriers were not just weapons of war, they were the vanguard of an economic system that could outproduce and outlast any adversary. This industrial superiority had a direct and devastating correlation to American operational tempo. While the Kriegsmarine was a force to carefully husband its few capital ships, planning each sortie as a high-stakes gamble, the U.S. Navy could maintain multiple carrier task forces on continuous aggressive operations across the globe. The Pacific War provided the most vivid illustration. German observers, monitoring the campaign through liaison officers in Tokyo, watched in awe as American forces executed their island-hopping campaign. Each amphibious assault was preceded and protected by carriers that acted as mobile, unsinkable air bases, neutralizing Japanese island fortresses without the need to first capture and painstakingly build airfields. The tempo was relentless. No sooner was one objective secured than the carrier groups moved on to the next, their decks swarming with aircraft that maintained constant pressure on the enemy. For German strategists, the implications were clear. If this same doctrine were applied in the European theater, no Axis-held coastline from Norway to the Bay of Biscay would be safe. The traditional advantage of defending a fortified shore was nullified by a fleet that brought its own air superiority with it. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, which German analysts studied intently, served as the ultimate confirmation of this new reality. Dubbed the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, the battle demonstrated the qualitative and quantitative supremacy of American carrier aviation. Hundreds of veteran Japanese aircraft were annihilated by U.S. Navy pilots and anti-aircraft fire, while the American fleet emerged virtually unscathed. To German officers, this was not just a Japanese defeat, it was a preview. It showed that a mature carrier force could establish such overwhelming dominance that an opposing air arm could be rendered ineffective in a single engagement. They understood that if the Luftwaffe ever faced such a concentrated and well-defended naval air power, the result would be similarly one-sided. By the war's final year, the image of the American aircraft carrier had become an inescapable and oppressive symbol in the minds of German naval commanders. In post-war interrogations and their later writings, they repeatedly returned to a specific word to describe them: unfathomable, unfathomable, or beyond comprehension. The carriers represented more than just a new type of warship. They embodied a holistic approach to warfare that fused technology, industry, logistics, and human capital into an instrument of power that was simply beyond Germany's strategic imagination. Captured admirals conceded that their pre-war doctrines, centered on the guerre de course and the decisive fleet action, had been rendered obsolete almost overnight. The battleship, the proud symbol of naval power for centuries, was now a vulnerable relic. The U-boat, though still a potent weapon, could no longer operate with freedom in seas dominated by carrier-based hunter-killer groups. Even the Atlantic Wall, in which Hitler had invested so much concrete and faith, was revealed as a brittle defense against an enemy that could project power directly onto any shoreline. Personal accounts from officers who had been temporary guests aboard these carriers carried a common theme of demoralization. They described the sensory overload of the flight deck, the sheer noise and organized chaos of launch operations, and the hum of vibrant life throughout the ship. For men whose wartime experience was defined by scarcity, anxiety, and the claustrophobic confines of U-boats, or the rigid discipline of surface ships, the abundance, confidence, and sheer space aboard an American carrier was a culture shock. It was a glimpse into a world where war was waged not with desperate tenacity, but with overwhelming, systematic confidence. In the final analysis, the legacy of the American aircraft carrier for the German officer corps was one of profound and bitter enlightenment. The floating cities were the handwriting on the wall, a physical manifestation of a new world order. They proved that the war had been decided not just on the battlefields of Stalingrad or the beaches of Normandy, but in the shipyards of Newport News and the factories of Detroit, long before the first shot was fired. For the men of the Kriegsmarine, who had entered the conflict believing in the supremacy of will and the power of the big gun, the carriers stood as the ultimate unanswerable argument that a new age had dawned. The sea, once ruled by the ship with the largest cannons, now belonged to the ship with the largest flight deck.